So what exactly is Corina Control, and how good is the deck in the current meta? Hey friend, welcome back to LOR Explained, it's Brother here, and today I'll be teaching you how to play Corina Control. But before we get into it, I know that the deck is super expensive to craft, so if you're still new and don't have a massive collection yet, make sure to stay to the end of the video because I'll be providing you a budget option for Corina Control to help get you started. So, Corina Control is all about stalling out the game for as long as we can so we can play two extremely scary late game threats. The first of which is Corina, which costs 9 mana and says, when you play Corina, obliterate the top 5 cards of your deck to deal 1 damage to all enemies for each spell obliterated. 27 of the 40 cards in our deck are spells, so the odds of us hitting at least 2 to 3 spells are pretty good. Now, the text is kind of unclear, which is a problem for a lot of other Runeterra cards as well, but when Corina deals damage to all enemies, that includes our opponent's Nexus as well. So Corina is great because she's able to deal damage to all of our opponent's creatures, as well as their life total. The downside, however, is that you won't always get the results that you want with Corina. Even though our deck has a bunch of spells, there's still going to be times where you whiff and only hit like 1 spell, while obliterating some non-spell cards that you might have actually wanted to draw. This, in turn, actually makes me believe that despite the deck is called Corina Control, the all-star of the deck is Commander Ledros. So, Commander Ledros has a play effect, which says, when you play Commander Ledros, deal damage to the enemy Nexus equal to half its health rounded up. This is a crazy ability. Top that with the fact that Commander Ledros is extremely hard to kill once he's played and you got yourself a win condition. Generally, you want to be playing Commander Ledros first, because we want to cut our opponent's health in half and then follow up with Corina so that she can finish off the game. Alright, so right now we know that our deck wants to play Corina and Commander Ledros, but exactly how is our deck going to stall out the game long enough to play them? Well, this is where our massive amount of removal spells come in. First, let's talk about Thermogenic Beam, Vile Feast, Mystic Shock, Static Shock, and Gotcha. These are cheap early game removal spells to help us control our opponent's board early during the first few rounds of the game. Let's quickly go over each one. Thermogenic Beam. Great card, can't be played during combat because it's slow, but scales well throughout the game. Vile Feast is amazing at picking off 1 health creatures, and getting a spider is actually pretty relevant in this deck because of Elise, but we'll touch on that later. Static Shock, also just great at sniping 1 health creatures and draws us a card, which is always nice. And finally, Gotcha just does a flat 3 damage. The card can be a little spicy if you play it for its reduced cost, but overall, a lot of important champions such as Heimerdinger and Ezreal have 3 health, so Gotcha is going to be great at helping you deal with those threats. Moving on, in this deck, we also have Grasp of the Undying and Withering Wail. Believe it or not, aggro strategies like Burn Aggro and Kinkou Lucis are still running around, so gaining some life is pretty relevant in those matchups and can really pull you ahead. And finally, on the higher end of the curve, we have Atrocity, Vengeance, and the Ruination. Now, first, I just want to be really clear that Atrocity isn't exactly a removal spell. Most of the time, you're going to be using Atrocity to kill either Corina or Commander Ledros and target your opponent's Nexus, and have it act as sort of another finisher. But since technically you can target anything with Atrocity, it can be used as a removal spell. So only if there's some sort of scenario where you really need to kill your opponent's unit and you literally have no other option in your hand but Atrocity, then you can consider using it as a removal spell. Otherwise, try to save it as a finisher or as a way to respond to spells like Will of Ionia. In terms of Vengeance, there's not much to say about it except it just does what it says and kills off a unit. And finally, the Ruination is just a massive board wipe. It's great for punishing players that overextend and helps you buy time to find Corina and Ledros. Okay, so that's pretty much the gist of our removal spells. Now, our deck can't solely rely on removal spells just to get to the late game, so we're going to need some sort of way to gain some board presence. Earlier, I mentioned that getting a spider from Vile Feast was going to be relevant. Well, this is because a part of our deck includes a spider package. Let me explain. So, Corina Control is really good at beating board-centric decks, and it's not just because of cards like Withering Wail and the Ruination, but it's also because of how effective our spider package can be. Elise, Frenzied Skitter, and Brood Awakening can create a wide board of threatening spiders extremely fast, and can also help getting some good chip damage onto our opponent. There are actually going to be times where you're going to be able to level Elise up, and that's going to be really useful as she gives herself and all of our spiders Challenger. Challenger gives us the option to pick off our opponent's weaker creatures, and honestly, I wouldn't even be afraid of using Elise to kill off our opponent's bigger units, since our main game plan is to win the game through Ledros and Corina, not Elise. Also, because we can create a bunch of spiders in this deck, we have Glimpse Beyond, which we can use to kill our own spiders to help us draw into our late game threats. Last but not least, the last card in our deck is Vi. It's kind of a bummer that she recently got nerfed from 5 to 4 health, but she's still going to do her job well, which is to challenge our opponent's units during the mid game, especially the ones we wouldn't normally be able to deal with, like Ezreal. So to sum it up, Corina Control wants to stall out the game through removal spells and spiders, play Commander Ledros and Corina, and finish off our opponent before they can redevelop their board. The deck is really good at dealing with our opponent's units while also being good at building a board of units itself. It's also a very slow deck, but extremely good at winning the late game once it gets there. And in order to be successful with the deck, you need to be efficient with your removal spells and play according to the matchup. Here's some tips. So first, against aggro decks, you want to prioritize stopping the early pressure. Cards like Elise and Whispering Whale are going to be amazing since they trade well into our opponent's board. Corina is a board-centric control deck, which means that it's going to naturally do well against most aggro and mid-range decks since they heavily rely on putting units on the board. With that in mind, our second point is against mid-range decks. Ruination is going to be your best friend against these type of strategies. A mid-range deck like Mid-Range Bannerman relies heavily on playing out their hand on curve. They aren't amazing at building back their board once it's gone, so a well-timed Ruination is going to be deadly for them. Finally, control matchups are going to be the trickiest for most players who are just starting out with Corina Control. This is especially true against Ionia-based Karma decks. These decks don't depend on having a wide board of units and don't care about Corina and Ledros as much since they completely outvalue you on turn 10 with what Karma does. So, against these type of decks, you want to try and take the role of the aggressor rather than the control player. This is where the Spider package becomes really useful, since Elise, Frenzied Skitter, and Brood Awakening can rack up a lot of damage depending on the situation. Okay, we're slowly reaching the end of the video, but before we wrap things up, I know that Corina Control is not a cheap deck to craft. According to Mobalytics, the deck costs about 30,000 shards, which is absurd for newer players just starting out in Legends of Runeterra. But no fear, there are some adjustments that we can make to the deck that can slowly ease you into the archetype. My budget option is about 19,600 shards, which is still fairly expensive, but doable after you play the game for a little bit. I made sure the core gameplay of the deck is still there, so make sure to check it out in the description below for the deck code. Anyways, that about wraps up my guide for Corina Control. Some cards in Corina Control can honestly be changed depending on the meta. For example, some decks will include 2 Ruinations instead of 1, so if you have an alternate deck list for Corina Control, feel free to share it with me. And if you guys have any suggestions on which deck I should cover next, just let me know in the comments below.